Welcome to this week's episode of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two things. The first one is going to be the hunger strike that started by Ruben Vardanyan against this absurd Stalinist show trial that they have been putting him through in Baku. And then we're going to close with an analysis of a very long press conference held by former President Robert Kocharyan last week. In response to the absurd Stalinist show trial that's being held in Baku for Mr. Vardanyan and the other Armenian hostages, in which they're being accused of all kinds of things which they were obviously never guilty of, Mr. Vardanyan started a hunger strike that unfortunately is deteriorating his physical condition and is actually putting his life in danger. Everyone's worried about what we're going to be heading into over the next couple of days as this thing moves forward. In response to this, for the first time ever, the Armenian government actually spoke out publicly and denouncing these absurd show trials in Baku in a speech in Switzerland. And actually on multiple occasions after that, Armenian Foreign Minister Arad Mirzoyan and others from the Armenian Foreign Ministry have denounced these sham trials. This could actually be an indicator of the realization that this government is having that the entire peace process is dead, or actually more likely them actually coming out publicly with this notion that the peace process is dead no matter what they say. And if that's the case, the only logical step from this point on, if we actually want to achieve justice and to have security and actually free the prisoners, is to move towards ICC filings against the regime for the genocide in Artsakh and the war crimes committed in 22. You know, in watching and analyzing all of this, when you're watching the images of these trials, there's almost something Shakespearean about this. In this nation or state with millions of people, millions of Armenians, there's one person, in this case Mr. Vardanyan, that's actually willing to fight for his own rights, or to say that everything that's happened in the last 5 years is unacceptable, as everyone just goes on with their lives. This is the moment that history has put him in, and he is the one that's teaching us how to act like men when we are actually a nation of half men. For that, we will be always grateful to Mr. Vardanyan. Now let's move on to the second topic of the week, which was the long press conference held by former President Kocharyan. If you watched all of it, and it was 4 hours long, he is actually very much in command, and he is actually poised, even answering questions that were not favorable to him. The press conference itself can really be divided into three sections. There's the first part, what he says is actually true and correct, things that he's correct about. The second part is more frankly farcical. And the last part, which I would say was simply sad. Let's move on to the first part, which is the things that he was correct on. He criticized this government in comparison to himself, actually, and his regime of not allowing certain diasporans to enter the country, people that have spoken against this government. And he's actually 100% correct with that. It's actually the wrong way to approach things. He went on to criticize this government's poor attitude and neglect towards the Armenians of Artsakh, and actually criticized people from Artsakh for not being aggressive enough in defending their own rights. He went on to criticize this government for not fighting hard enough to release our hostages held in the dungeons of Baku, and again, he's totally correct about that. He criticized the government for not keeping the military option in taking back portions of Armenia that are occupied by the Azeri regime at this time, since this government says that they're going to use the demarcation process to actually get those lands back, which is obviously fantasy. I understand where the government's coming from, but his basic sentiments are correct. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, he went in detail correcting some of the distortions that this prime minister always uses to sort of absolve himself of the disaster in Artsakh by inventing his own history of negotiations and other things that went on in the negotiating process between Armenia and Azerbaijan and the world for the past 30 years. Now let's move to the farcical part of the press conference. Mr. Kocharyan was actually asked about his wealth and the asset forfeiture cases that are against him by prosecutors about monies that were purportedly stolen by him. His response in so many words was that he wished that he owned all the assets that people claimed that he did. And he actually specifically brought up the Zangezur copper mine, which many people suspect he's a part owner of. Let's just say this part of this press conference was not very credible because everybody knows that Mr. Kocharyan is actually personally a very wealthy man. Then he moved on to make excuses for the CSTO and essentially defended their lack of action when Armenia was invaded by Azerbaijan in 2022. He actually blamed his government for not having good relations with many members of the CSTO, because we all know how important it is to have good and friendly relations with such world powers as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Belarus. Who needs Germany, France, the United States, and the EU when you can have world powers like that on our side? Then, he went on to criticize this government for not allowing prominent Russian public figures that have said critical things of this government or have made anti-Armenian statements from entering Armenia. I frankly don't disagree with him on this, since I'm a free speech absolutist. But one of the examples he brought up was the head of RT, Ms. Margarita Simonian, which, again, I think she should have been allowed into the country, because leaving her out looks worse than letting her in and saying what he's going to say. But let's not pretend that that woman is anything much more than the Lord God's own personal monkey. Now let's move on to the sad part of his interview, during which Mr. Kocharyan made every single possible excuse that he can for the Russian state's criminal war against the people of Artsakh and Armenia over the last many years. According to him, we are always at fault, and the Russian state is always misunderstood. We always have to understand what their interests are and be cognitive of it, but they never have to understand or be cognitive of our interests. And worst of all, Mr. Kocharyan never acknowledged the context in which Armenia's pivot to the West happened post-Jermuk 22 invasion. If you want to see the real face of the Russian state, I will ask you to watch the following clips that we're going to play for you, which was the immediate coverage of the ethnic cleansing of Artsakh, post-ethnic cleansing. Pay specific attention to the words and see how similar all of those words are to essentially all the exact propaganda lines of the Baku regime.
After the capitulation of illegal armed formations in Karabakh, weapons, ammunition, and heavy equipment were surrendered to the authorities. Columns of refugees began moving from Karabakh to Armenia. Thousands were taken under the wing of Russian peacekeepers who fed them, kept them warm, and provided medical assistance where needed. I remind you that 5 of our peacekeepers, including the deputy commander of the contingent, died in those events. President Aliyev officially apologized to Vladimir Putin for the unintentional actions of his military and promised to punish those responsible. Pashinyan made his choice and can write a complaint about himself. Additionally, weapons were secretly moving from Armenia towards Stepanakert through the Lachin corridor by any means necessary. Otherwise, where did all the weapons come from that were now being surrendered to Azerbaijani authorities after their counter-terrorist operation? Pashinyan declares that all Armenians will leave Karabakh. Sounds like an order, doesn't it? Why inflame things so much? Against this background, President Aliyev is objectively interested in having at least some Karabakh Armenians stay in their homes and creating normal living conditions for them. Azerbaijan's foreign ministry, Prime Minister Pashinyan knows well that the departure of Armenians living in the Karabakh region of Azerbaijan is their personal decision and has nothing to do with forced displacement. If any segment of the Armenian population doesn't want to live under and obey Azerbaijani law and authority, we cannot force them to do so. On the contrary, we urge Armenian residents not to leave their places of residence and to be part of multi-ethnic Azerbaijani society. In any case, these are complex processes. One truly feels sorry for the Armenians. Both in Karabakh and in Armenia itself, they have become hostages of irresponsible politicians who ultimately led to surrender to the West with difficult prospects.
What we just watched is Mr. Putin's Russia. This is not the Tsar's Russia. This is not Soviet Russia. This is not even Boris Yeltsin's Russia. Those Russias all had more demerits than they had redeeming qualities, but they had some redeeming qualities. Putin's Russia has no redeeming qualities. Everything and everyone in that state is for sale, and any agreements with them or any guarantees from them mean absolutely nothing. Now, what does all of this mean? In real hard political terms, it actually means five more years of Nikol Pashinyan, because if you actually watch this 4-hour interview, it was actually a 4-hour-long suicide note. Mr. Kocharyan, the ARF, Bagrat 2.0, and all the other pro-Russian forces in Armenia are actually the gift that keeps on giving to the current government, since on their best day, all of them put together are good for about 25 to 30% of the vote in any election. If Mr. Kocharyan and his allies are actually serious about defeating this government, the first thing they need to do is to exit the political stage and allow or back other political forces that are not encumbered by their negative baggage or unpopular positions. Thank you for joining me in this sort of insights.
I found my thrill on Blueberry Hill, on Blueberry Hill. When I found you, the moon stood still on Blueberry Hill and lingered until my dreams came true. The wind in the willow played love's sweet melody, but all those vows we made were never to be.